This is the story of Spartacus, one of history's greatest warriors, who led an army of slaves against the might of the Roman Empire. Spartacus was born into slavery around 111 BC in the Greek city of Thera. His father was a Greek, while his mother was a Thracian, which made Spartacus a slave of mixed blood. When he was just a young boy, Spartacus was sold to a gladiator school, where he spent most of his childhood. Unlike most slaves in the ancient world, Spartacus had some advantages that would eventually help him overthrow the Roman Empire. He was literate, thanks to his Greek father, and knew how to read and write. Plus, he was a strong and able-bodied man, the perfect candidate to become a feared gladiator. But there was more to Spartacus than just brute strength and intelligence. He was brave, cunning, charismatic, and perhaps most importantly, he hated the Romans. In ancient Rome, gladiators were seen as little more than tools for the amusement of the wealthy elite. They were forced to fight each other, or wild animals, for the enjoyment of the crowd. The matches took place in large open-air arenas, the largest of which was the Colosseum, which could hold up to 80,000 spectators. There were many different types of gladiators, but they all had one thing in common: they were slaves. They were forced to endure horrible punishments if they didn't fight well enough. And if they lost a match, they were often killed. It was a brutal life, but it was also incredibly dangerous. Even if a gladiator wasn't killed during a match, he could easily die from his wounds. Without modern medical care, a cut or bruise could quickly become infected and lead to death. Plus, gladiators were often forced to fight to the death, not only against other gladiators, but also against wild animals like lions and tigers. So if you were a gladiator, you had to be strong, brave, and have a strong will to survive. When Spartacus first entered the arena, he was just another nameless slave fighting for his life. But soon everyone would know his name. One day, Spartacus found himself in the same gladiator school as a man named Crassus. The two became friends and shared their dreams of freedom. However, this friendship would end tragically when Crassus betrayed Spartacus. Crassus was a cunning fighter who was able to work his way up the ranks of the gladiator school. Eventually, he became the favorite of the crowds and was set to be released from slavery as a reward. However, Crassus was a coward, and he chose to betray Spartacus and the other gladiators in order to save himself. He alerted the guards to their plan to escape, and as a result, many gladiators were killed. But Spartacus managed to get away. He fled into the mountains, where he lived as a hermit for years. But he never gave up hope of one day returning to the gladiator school and freeing his fellow slaves. Several years passed, and during that time, Spartacus honed his combat skills. He trained with local tribes and developed a fighting style that was a combination of Greek and Thracian techniques. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire continued its policy of brutal oppression in the provinces. This caused many slaves to rebel, but none of these rebellions were successful. In fact, most of them were crushed within weeks. This was partly because the slaves were disorganized and poorly armed, but it was also because the Roman army was just too powerful. The Roman army was the most disciplined and effective fighting force in the ancient world. Its soldiers were well trained and equipped, and they were led by brilliant generals. As a result, the Roman army was virtually unbeatable. But everything would change with the appearance of Spartacus. By 73 BC, Spartacus was ready to take action. He returned to the gladiator school where he had once been a slave. With a small group of followers, he launched a daring attack, killing everyone in his path. From there, he gathered more and more supporters. Soon he had an army of over 100,000 men, women, and children, all eager for freedom. This was a huge threat to the Roman Empire, and the government sent out the army to deal with it. But Spartacus and his army were too strong. They won battle after battle, and at one point, Spartacus even managed to capture a Roman town. This had never been done before. No slave had ever managed to defeat the Roman army. But Spartacus was no ordinary slave. He was a brilliant military leader, and under his command, the slave army grew to over 200,000 strong. By 71 BC, the slave army was so powerful that the Roman government had to declare war on them. This may sound unbelievable, but it's true. Rome had never before declared war on slaves, but Spartacus was such a threat that they had no choice. The Roman army was sent to put down the rebellion once and for all, but they were unable to stop Spartacus. He continued to win victory after victory until finally the slave army reached the gates of Rome itself. At this point, it seemed like Rome was doomed. How could they have possibly resisted the mighty Spartacus? But then something unexpected happened. The Roman Senate offered Spartacus a deal. They would grant him citizenship and release him from slavery if he would lay down his arms. Spartacus accepted the offer, and the rebellion ended. However, not all slaves were so lucky. In total, over 100,000 slaves died in the Third Civil War. And although Spartacus and his followers had won a great victory, it came at a great cost. Unfortunately, history doesn't tell us what happened to Spartacus after he was granted Roman citizenship. We don't know if he ever married or had children, and we don't know how he died. All we know is that he was one of the greatest warriors in history, and that he led an army of slaves against the Roman Empire and actually won. Even though Spartacus is a legendary warrior, there's still much that we don't know about him. Most of what we do know comes from ancient Roman sources, and it is possible that they exaggerated or even lied about Spartacus in order to make him look bad. You see, Spartacus was a threat to the Roman way of life. He represented everything that the Romans feared: poverty, slavery, and violence. So it's not surprising that the Romans didn't put Spartacus on a pedestal. In fact, they did everything they could to discredit him. According to Roman sources, Spartacus was a brutal and merciless warrior who slaughtered anyone who opposed him. He was also said to be a traitor and a liar. For example, he was accused of killing his own men in order to steal their weapons. Of course, we can't know how much of this is true, but it's clear that the Romans wanted to make Spartacus look as bad as possible. Despite this, Spartacus has become a symbol of courage and resistance against oppression. He is remembered as the warrior who took on the Roman Empire and almost won. If you think about it, Spartacus's story is actually pretty crazy. He went from being a lowly gladiator to leading an army that was threatening to destroy Rome. And although he didn't win in the end, he still accomplished something that no other slave had ever done before. He showed the Romans that slaves were capable of great things and that they shouldn't be underestimated. Spartacus was born a slave, but he died a hero. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. That's all for now. See you next time.